everybody's okay. As I was saying, a big warm welcome to Fowler members. Thank you so much for your support. For one, it enables us to offer these educational programs. A special hello to Michael Rohde, who is board chair of the Fowler's Textile Council. Hi, Michael. And our appreciation to our promotional partner, Sherry Hunter, and the Textile Museum Associates of Southern California. Thank you, Sherry. Thank you all for joining us for this very special program with Leslie Rinchen-Wongmo, who will share about her incredible journey to India, where she discovered the sacred art of Tibetan applique and became the first American woman and one of few non-Tibetans trained to master the Buddhist art of silk applique tanka. Leslie is a textile artist, teacher, and author. Last year, she published the critically acclaimed book, Threads of Awakening, An American Woman's Journey into Tibet's Sacred Textile Art, which includes a foreword by the Dalai Lama. Her artwork has been exhibited internationally, featured in many magazines, and in the documentary, Creating Buddhas, The Making and Meaning of Fabric Tankas. And to share the gift of Tibetan applique with stitchers around the globe, Leslie created the Stitching Buddhas virtual apprentice program, an online hands-on course that bridges East and West, traditional and contemporary. After 2 decades abroad, Leslie is now back in her native Southern California, and I'd like to put a link to her website in the chat if any of you would like to learn more about Leslie. It's a terrific website. Now it is my pleasure to turn this over to Leslie. I ask that you keep your audio muted throughout the duration of the program, and please ask questions in the chat section, and I will facilitate the Q&A at the end of the presentation. And I will turn it over to Leslie.
Hello. Well, how wonderful to be here. Thank you. I was telling Chris and Monica, I have an ancient connection to the Fowler Museum. I did an internship in the conservation department back in, I believe, 2009 or 10. It was a period where I was considering studying art conservation, but didn't really have the science background for it. So in the end, I didn't do it, but it was a wonderful way to connect and to learn an incredible amount about what happens behind the scenes at museums. So I'm really grateful for that and excited to be here with people who some of you I know only through email newsletters and such. And so it's wonderful to be able to be here and share something about my art and my story and my book and all of that with you. So I'm going to be showing a slideshow. Let me see if I can get that. Let me share my screen. All right. Let's see. There we go. So in 1992, I bought a one-way ticket to Singapore, thinking that I was going to travel around Asia and maybe other parts of the world for 1 year. I had actually finished grad school in 1988, and I had taken a trip to India, my first trip. It was customary at the time to travel somewhere between finishing grad school and starting a job. I'd studied urban planning and management, and most of my classmates were going to Europe, but I wanted to go somewhere that really challenged my assumptions and my way of seeing the world more. So I took this, what I thought was a great adventure, to Kashmir and Ladakh, northern India. And it was a 3-week guided trekking excursion. And on that trip, I met people who had been traveling with their backpack, solo, independent travel for 6 months, a year, some people who had done the Peace Corps and stayed on. And I just became completely intrigued by that. And also on that trip, I met Tibetans for the first time, and I felt a kind of kinship. So I went back home and worked for a couple of years, saved up some money and bought that one-way ticket. And I had arranged to volunteer for a few months in a town called Dharamsala, which is in northern India, in the foothills of the Himalayas, in the Indian state of Himachal Pradesh. It's the home of the indigenous Gadi people. It was a summer hill station during colonial times for the British to escape the heat. And it's now a popular tourist destination for people all over India. And it also welcomes exiles from Tibet and international students, travelers, and volunteers. So I had arranged to volunteer for an undefined period, but I thought it would be about 2 months for the Tibetan government in exile there. The Dalai Lama settled in Dharamsala in 1959 after fleeing the Chinese occupation of Tibet, and established a government, a quasi-government administration there. And so I had arranged, with my background in urban planning and management, to help with some economic development projects there. And I ended up helping them design their first population census, their first demographic census, which was not carried out while I was volunteering there because they didn't get the funding right away, but which was done about 5 years later with the design that I had worked on with a retired Indian census official. So they finally did their first population census. So I was a part of that. But while I was volunteering there, I was also taking classes in Buddhist philosophy and Tibetan language. And I was asked one day to accompany a visiting American who was starting a company to sell Tibetan handicrafts in the United States to make money that would also go back to the Tibetan community to help their economic development there. So we went on a tour of traditional art centers in the area. And one of the places we visited was this, which is called Norbulinka. Clearly it was under construction still at the time. But inside there were already workshops happening. Now it's an amazing center for Tibetan cultural preservation. If any of you have a chance to go to Dharamsala or anywhere in the area, I recommend you visit there. But at that time, it was just in the beginning. And so we went inside and we visited wood carving, metal sculpture, tanka painting, rug weaving, all kinds of different workshops. And then we walked into this one. There were a group of young Tibetans sitting on the floor around a very low table, stitching and ironing and laughing and creating things like this out of fabric. And this. And I had done some quilting back in my college days. I had stopped because I'd had a back injury that made it hard to sit and stitch. So I hadn't done it for a while, but I had that in my fingers and in my bones, this love of fabric and color and putting pieces together. And I didn't know what these creatures were, but I knew they were somehow connected to the Buddhist tradition and philosophy that I was learning in the mornings, and that they were protectors in some way of the Dharma practitioners and the teachings. And somehow when I looked on them, it was like love at first sight. I just caught my breath. I didn't know what to say. I was just gazing at them. The rest of the economic development group was ready to go on to the next workshop, and I was stuck. So I wanted to know more. And when I went back, I started asking everybody back where I lived at the Tibetan Library in Dharamsala, where I might learn this art form. Now, at the Tibetan Library where I was living, I had become familiar with tanka painting. This is an example of a tanka painting that was in progress that a friend of mine was working on. There was a tanka painting school at the library where I was living. Now, tankas are two-dimensional art that rolls up. They're scrolls, basically. They're pictorial scrolls. And most of them are painted with mineral colors on canvas and then framed in brocade fabric. So they're soft and pliant and they can roll up. You can see that while it's in progress, it's stretched on a stretcher frame, but when they're done painting, they cut it out and sew it into a brocade frame. And these images that they contain are usually meditation deities. They're figures that are often mistakenly referred to as gods and goddesses, but really they're not gods and goddesses, and they're not to be worshipped, even though there are many, many different ways to relate to them. But basically, they're embodiments of our highest qualities, the qualities that we want to cultivate and uncover on the path to spiritual awakening. So our compassion, our wisdom, our discernment, our clear seeing, our altruistic intention, our love. And they can be seen as embodiments of pure compassion that we aspire to and relate to and give offerings to, or they can be seen as the embodiment of our own potential. So who we will be or can be when we have fully taken away all our obstructions and distortions and neuroses and patterns of misunderstanding that we have. So they're part of the Vajrayana Buddhist tradition, and it uses imagination as a way to awaken those qualities in ourselves and to clear away the negative patterns that get in the way of our being our very best. So this one, for example, is Manjushri, as an embodiment of pure wisdom. And I'm going to go on and talk about how, so this one was a painting. This is actually one that I made that's made from pieces of fabric. Here is an embodiment of Chenrezi, or Avalokiteshvara, who represents our fully awakened compassion. And the Dalai Lama is considered a living embodiment of this deity. So I'm going to read a little section from my book about how Vajrayana uses imagination to uncover our highest qualities, and then I'll go on to talk about the textile technique itself. The Vajrayana practices supported by tankas use imagination to align our view with reality. Vajrayana recognizes that what we think we know is usually mistaken, clouded by grasping for an independent self that doesn't exist. It concedes that what we can imagine, if we practice enlightened imagining, could be more real than what we think we know. Visualization of oneself as a deity is, from one point of view, fake it till you make it training. From another point of view, it's pure vision of true nature. It's a practice in seeing what's left when stories are removed or replaced. What appears when we slip a different lens onto the kaleidoscopic camera through which we see ourselves and the world. Visualizing myself as the deity allows me to step into another reality that is simultaneously and equally true, or perhaps even truer. It's a reality in which I'm already also enlightened. Yes, I'm the frightened, anxious girl who makes tankas as best she can, who talks too loudly, who loves to laugh, who picks at her fingers and pulls on her eyebrows, and worries after each encounter that she's taken up too much space in the conversation. I'm the woman who has never kept a regular meditation practice and always thinks she should. I'm the woman who cares deeply about kindness and justice and feels inadequate before all the world's meanness and injustice, much of it perpetrated by her own government. I'm the woman who speaks of love and tolerance, but can't get along with her own mother and barely restrains herself from throwing things at the irritating relative who dominates every holiday gathering. Yes, all this is true on one level. And at the same time, with a breath and a shift, I'm space. This, Leslie, is just a point of view, a continuum of experiences. In this moment, here, now, on this ground, with this breath, I am joy, I am love, I am awake, I am Buddha. So these images are used for practices which can go from the simplest to the most complex, but of practices of imagining ourselves into that truer, more awake version of ourselves. So as I mentioned, most tankas are painted. And in a tanka painting, color and pattern are laid on the surface of a canvas. And later that canvas is stitched into brocade. But the art I discovered that day at that cultural center, Norbulinka, was a completely different kind of tanka. This form is made from stitching pieces of fabric together. It's much, much rarer than painting, and so rare, in fact, that most of the Tibetans I spoke to when I got back to the library after the tour had never heard of it. It took a lot of effort to find a teacher. And I'm not going to go through all the stories of finding a teacher here today, but they are in my book, and it was a challenge. But I was lucky enough to first find one teacher who was an incredible artist, but not very interested in teaching. And then finally to connect with a teacher who was really committed to passing on the tradition. And this tradition goes back at least 500 years, at least to the 15th century in Tibet. It also spread around the region to Ladakh, Bhutan, and Mongolia. And it was used often to make these enormous images of Buddhas. The advantage of fabric being so supple is you could make these enormous images that then could be folded or rolled up, where a painting of that size, if it had to be manipulated to roll up, the paint would start to crack after a while, as it, it would be harder to keep it intact and preserved. But fabric is soft and you can fold and roll it. And so it was adapted to this enormous display. And this was allowing thousands of people to view these images at one time. And so this is the Potala Palace in Lhasa in Tibet. And this kind of a display would be made just once a year for a day, or once every 3 years, 7 years, 12 years, depending on the specifics of the traditions and the festivals for which they would display them. But they were also made on a smaller scale. I never made anything on this large a scale, but you will see in a while a fairly large piece that I got to work on. So this is my teacher, the second teacher, Dorje Wangdu, with whom I ended up doing at least 4 years, I guess, of apprenticeship. And here he is transferring a part of a drawing to the green silk satin fabric. And he was a monk when I began my apprenticeship. Later, he disrobed and he now has a family. And this is in the Tsemkang, the workshop where we learned. You can see we had a fun, joyful atmosphere. These two young women are stitching the brocade frame for a large painted tanka. And these are some of my other colleagues. And this was how we sat on the floor around the table. And I'm going to read another piece about sort of how I fit into the Tsemkang. And I want to explain Tsemkang. One of the things I love about the Tibetan language is it, just as this artwork is made of pieces of fabric, the Tibetan language is created from pieces of meaning, in a sense. So the different individual syllables of a word carry meaning, and compound words are made from putting pieces of meaning together. So for example, size, the word for size is made up of large, small, put together. The word for temperature is made up of hot and cold, put together. So the Tsemkang, the room where we worked, where we stitched, is made up of tsem, which is to sew, and kang, which is a house. So it's a sewing house. So this piece of my book, the chapters are called pieces as well. Piece 29 is called Step into the Tsemkang. I squeezed into my place at the low table that filled one end of the large workshop. Just 15 inches off the floor, its surface was covered by a threadbare white tablecloth. Wool mats wrapped in blue cotton softened the floor on 3 sides. These meager cushions would make long hours of sitting on concrete tolerable. The space between walls and table was just wide enough for me to walk around on the mats and take my seat. Sunlight streamed in from the windows that dominated 2 of the walls from waist height to ceiling. The 3rd wall was inset with shallow shelves. A boombox sat on one shelf beneath a photo of the Dalai Lama. Another shelf was strewn with 10 or 12 cassette tapes in their boxes. A dozen apprentices sat cross-legged, sock-footed or barefoot around that vast table, each tending to a small piece of silk satin or brocade, individual contributions to a collective Buddha image. At 32, I was the oldest apprentice and the only Inji. My American-bred, chair-spoiled legs could not remain crossed for long before numbness and tingling set in. To keep the blood flowing, I extended my legs and leaned back against the cool concrete wall as I stitched. Now, as a rule, Tibetans refuse to step over books and bodies because pointing one's feet toward either is considered disrespectful. Words and people are respected as teachers. So when one of my fellow apprentices had to get up from the table, whether to retrieve materials, use the sewing machine, show Dorji Wongdo her progress, or visit the loo, her cross-legged Tibetan colleagues effortlessly cleared a path for her. They would lean forward just slightly over their neatly crossed legs, allowing her to pass behind them. But what to do with the sprawling foreigner whose legs spanned the path between wall and table? Sometimes I managed to quickly recross my legs and scoot forward to make space at my back. Other times I pulled my knees up and squished myself into the wall to make space for her to pass in front of me. I'd think the path was clear. But then, in a stunning act of propriety that made me cringe from my coarse Americanness, my colleague would reach down to lift a corner of my shawl where it was piled on the floor next to me, gently moving it out of her way to avoid disrespecting even my clothing with her foot. If they're this demonstrative in their respect for ordinary people, imagine the respect they show to Tankas, whose images are believed to be manifestations of enlightenment, alive with the energy of the Buddhas they represent. Every piece of a Buddha to be deserved the highest esteem. Reverence permeated Dorji Wongdo's workshop, harmonizing with gossip and pop music. So there we are. I'm in the back there. All right, so here's how the work comes together. You start with the drawing. So as I said, with the Tanka painting, you're working with a canvas, you make a drawing, and then you apply colors onto it. But in this kind of work, the drawing is very similar to the drawing one would start with on a canvas, except that the drawing, the paper or the canvas, the cloth that the drawing is on, never actually becomes a part of the finished piece. Instead, it's a map and a template for creating lots and lots of pieces of colored silk that come together to create the image. The lines of the image, all the contour lines and outlines, are made of horsehair wrapped with silk thread. This creates a piping or a cord that is then couched to the surface of each piece of fabric. And one of the interesting things, if you've ever looked at hair under a microscope, any kind of hair, it's not smooth, it's not slick. It has kind of scales and crevices. And that allows it to kind of interact with the silk fibers, and the fibers cling to the hair. So as I wrap the thread around the hair, it stays wrapped. It doesn't come unraveled. And I'm going to demonstrate that at the end of or maybe in a few slides, I'm going to actually demonstrate it for you. What my teacher, Dorji Wongdo, so my first teacher, who I worked with only briefly, used the horsehair, and it is traditional to use the horsehair. My teacher, Dorji Wongdo, used nylon monofilament, or it was fishing line, actually. He would buy the fishing line in different gauges. And it allowed for longer lines, longer cords, but nylon thread is completely slick. There's no crevices for the silk to cling to. So you had to use an adhesive for the thread to stay wrapped around it. Plus, if you've ever tried to just tie a knot in a nylon thread, it doesn't want to tie, it bounces back, right? So in the same way, it wasn't as malleable to make the nice curves, undulating curves and sharp points. So horsehair really does the job better. There are some ways in which I like to move to more contemporary possibilities that we have available to us. And there are other ways in which the traditional forms really truly work better. And so I went back to a more traditional form when I started working on my own. So I'm going to switch my camera, just a moment, stop my share. And I'm going to switch my camera. All right, here we go. And I am going to show you the wrapping of, I got it started ahead of time because the beginning is really, can be finicky, and I didn't want to waste your time watching me fumble with it. But so you can see I have here, let's see if we can separate them. I have 3 strands of horsehair. They're not separating very well. Can you, let's see. Can you see how they're there? You can see sort of. Okay, so there's 3 strands of hair. And I put a blob of putty on the end to keep them weighted so they don't fly around. And then what I'm doing is with my right hand, with my dominant hand, I'm going to turn the hair. And with my left hand, I'm putting tension on the thread by pinching it between my thumbnail and my finger, the flesh of my finger. And I'm just turning, I'm making the hair rotate. And it is picking up the thread as I go. Probably could have used a different color that would have shown better the difference, but you can see that here it's wrapped and here it's just hair. Here, let me show you. Here you can see the hair is separated better. Okay, so I'm just turning it. And as I turn it, it wraps. And so what I would do is a whole length, complete it, and then do a second layer. Okay, because it tends to see it has some little bit of bumps and things, those smooth out with the second layer. So then once I finished wrapping the horsehair, I will show you what happens next. So I have transferred a bit of the drawing. So this is a drawing from a drawing of a lotus. So these are little bits of leaves that come below the lotus petals. And this is a stem. It's a split stem. Okay. One line of cord I have already stitched on. I'm going to show you how I stitch a line of cord on. So I've taken, this is just a little piece of one of my horsehair, silk wrapped horsehair cords. I use a big-eyed needle to carry the cord. This is a chenille needle with a large eye, and a fine needle to carry the thread. This is an applique sharp number 10 or 12. And I'm using the same thread that I used to wrap the cord to sew it onto the fabric. And that way the stitches are going to disappear into the cord pretty well. So I would start just at the end of one of the lines, and I'll come through the fabric from the back to the front, so that I've made a kind of a, it's not exactly a knot, it's just a stitching through the cord several times with the thread. It makes a kind of a bump there, so it keeps that on the back of the fabric. And then I will couch. So those of you who are familiar with stitching terms, I'm going to bring my fine needle up along the line. And basically what happens is I come up on one side, I go over and down on the other side of the cord and take a stitch. And that creates a loop that holds the cord to the fabric. So loop after loop, stitch after stitch. Oops. You have to use all your fingers to keep. So you'll see what I do is I take a stitch and then pull that loop and then a couple of tugs to make sure it's tight. And every now and then I'll come and I'll push it a little with my finger to make sure everything is setting down smoothly. So you can see basically what happens is because I'm using the same thread to stitch it as I use to wrap it, the stitches disappear. If you look on the other side, however, you can see the stitches. But on the front, they disappear into the cord. So that way, when I would get to the end of the line, I would go back down with the large needle and the end of the cord would go through. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the slideshow. Let's see, back to my face first. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So here you can see what I just showed you in live form. The large needle carries the cord and the finer needle carries the thread. And you can see here kind of all stages of it. You can see the lines that have been transferred from the drawing to the fabric. So this is probably, I think it's a belt. And then you can see where lines have already been couched with the cord, the horsehair cord. And then you can see over on the edge here, a piece that I have cut out. So the next step is to cut out every piece with a small margin of fabric. I think maybe it's like 1/8 of an inch around, leaving that. And then I'll turn those edges under. So here you can see couching a more elaborate piece. So here's a lot of pieces cut out with just a small margin around the outer line. And then I'll turn those edges under. And that I'm using a little screwdriver and my fingernail and some fabric glue to basically push that corded edge to make it stand out in relief and be sharp and be a clear outline of a piece. And then the pieces basically come together so that the corded outline of a piece covers the raw edge of a neighboring piece. And then all the pieces are stitched together using that same couching stitch, but the second time over, I'm couching over the cord, but through the next fabric, the adjoining fabric. So all the pieces are put together. This is often called Tibetan applique. It's just normally referred to that way, but it's really not applique strictly. It is really a patchwork because applique strictly means that there's a foundation to which you apply pieces. Right? In this case, instead, the pieces are depending on each other. It's an assemblage, it's like a jigsaw puzzle of interdependent pieces. And I really like that imagery and that construction because it echoes the view of reality that's taught in Buddhist philosophy and also in science, that nothing exists independently. Everything is created based on its interconnections, its parts, its pieces. We ourselves even do not exist as an island, as an independent self. I exist in relation to you. I exist in relation and in total dependence and gratitude to my parents, for example, so everything is dependent on many things. None of us exists completely independently, even if we feel like we do a lot, which is a lot of what the practice in Buddhism is about, is aligning our view with reality and not feeling so completely separate and static and independent, but more relational. So here you see the pieces coming together bit by bit, cluster by cluster, until the deity emerges, dependent on interconnections, just like us. And then finally, everything is sewn together, so piece by piece, until there's this huge, elaborate piece that she's sewing the final, making the final connections. I kind of want to show you another piece on the document camera, but I think maybe it's best to wait till the end. What do you think, Chris? Should I show the document camera again to show the way the layers come together, or should I wait to the end? What's your opinion?
Well, I mean, you're doing fine on time. I would say, another 10 minutes if you have time to fit it in. Great.
All right, let me switch then to the camera again. Okay. It's amazing. It's amazing to be able to do this at all. All right. So here you can see, this is a Buddha that actually was made. The pieces were made by my students, and then I stitched them together. So this was a collaborative piece. But here you can see the intricacy of all the different pieces coming together. And you can see the chords around every piece that become an outline, and then some of the chords that are more contour lines where it hasn't been cut out, but every edge, it's been cut out and turned under. And so you don't see any raw edges, right? But if you look at the back, there's no foundation, there's no single unifying piece. They're just all interdependent. So everywhere you can see, for example, here, this is a raw edge, there's no cord, but you don't see that on the front because it's covered by the corded outline of this gold arm. So everywhere, and it's a kind of engineering problem when you're putting it together, which piece goes on top. And even before putting it together, when you're first looking at the whole drawing and transferring the pieces to their appropriate color of fabric, there's a determination about, like, does this line belong to the green or does it belong to the arm? It's obvious once we see it here, but in the process, in some places with the robes and the clothing, there are decisions to make and distinctions to discern in terms of the layering, and mistakes to be made and lessons to be learned as well. So as I showed you the couching stitch for putting the cord onto the fabric. And then when the pieces are clustered together, I'd use a little fabric glue to initially stick them together. And then you do the same couching stitch. I don't have any thread, but I just want to show you. Basically, you would come up next to the cord there. You can see my needle coming up. And then you would make a loop and then go down in that little gap between fabric and cord. And so those loops then, instead of attaching the cord to the gold, they'd be attaching the gold to the green over that red line. Okay, so hope that's clear. And I will accept any questions when we get to the end. So one of the things that happened in the workshop is that my teacher would assign students based on, so he held the drawing and he transferred the bits of the drawing to the appropriate color of fabric. And then he would call one of us, one of the apprentices, depending on our skill level. So beginners would do flower petals and clouds maybe, and then you'd start to do pieces of the robe and leaves and things that were a little more intricate. And then you'd start to, eventually you would do hands and feet. And then finally, you would learn to do eyes. This was the last piece. And in Tibetan, in Thangka painting, eyes are the last thing to be painted. There even is some kind of a ceremony sometimes called opening the eyes, when the energy and spirit and force of the deity is believed to come into the painting. Well, in applique, in this kind of stitching work, you can't put the eyes, open the eyes last, because the eyes have to be put onto the face piece of fabric before the face piece of fabric is attached to the body piece of fabric. So it's not the last thing to be done, but it is the last thing learned. Well, the problem was I wanted to, since my teacher controlled all that initial drawing to piece step, and then the putting together of the pieces according to their placement on the drawing. If I was ever going to learn to do this on my own, I needed to master that whole process. So I started working in my off hours on my own work, but I hadn't learned how to do the eyes yet. So I asked my friend Alex, who was a Lithuanian Thangka painter studying at the library. I asked him to draw me a Thangka without eyes so that I could master this process of going from drawing to pieces and pieces to fully arranged image without knowing eyes. So he drew me this landscape kind of piece, which looks like a traditional Thangka, except in the place where the deity would be. Instead, there's this kind of vase made of rock with waterfalls cascading from it and a flower taking the place of the deity. And so this was the first piece I did in my off hours, in my evenings, to learn how to put everything together. And I used simple cotton fabric from the bazaar and sewing machine thread. It's quite rough, but it did teach me how to do it. And then in the meantime, in my apprenticeship, I started learning the eyes. I spent 1 year making all these little faces, learning to do the eyes. And there's a very particular embroidery stitch, a spiraling of thread to create the pupil and iris and whites of the eyes. And then they're outlined with cords, just like the other pieces. So these are some of the many faces that I worked on over the course of a year. Some of them very, very tiny. And then here's the large piece I said we would come to. That's me in 1996 or something like that. And the figure in the lower right corner, Nagarjuna, an important Indian Buddhist philosopher in, I believe, the 1st century AD. That was the first major figure in a Thangka that I did the face for one of our collaborative pieces. And soon thereafter, when I had finished my apprenticeship and was starting to do my own work, I requested an audience with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and was incredibly fortunate to be granted such an audience. This is my first Thangka fully completed on my own, Thangka with eyes. And my father, the other man in this picture is my father, because it turned out he was visiting me at the time that I was granted the audience with His Holiness. And so I asked if my dad could accompany me, and they said yes, which was such a wonderful blessing and gift to be able to give my dad. Probably the most satisfying part of that meeting was before we actually started. So the audience was in English. His Holiness speaks English, although often he has a translator with him and he'll revert to Tibetan when it's a more complex idea. But in the beginning, before I'd started asking questions, and His Holiness had just walked in and he sat down, and under his breath, he said to himself in Tibetan, which means, oh, it's very beautiful, it's very well made. And even though I would not have been able to have a whole conversation in Tibetan. By that time, I knew Tibetan pretty well and I could understand. And I could have gone home right after that. That was already the best thing I could have for him to acknowledge my work in that way. But I did ask his advice about taking forth this tradition into the world, because I wanted to be sure that I did so in a way that was respectful. I consider this just an enormous gift that I received from Tibetans. And I, not being Tibetan myself, I wanted to make sure that whatever I did was respectful and in alignment with their aims. And so who better to ask than the Dalai Lama? And he encouraged me, and he told me to approach my work with an attitude of excellence, like do your very best, always, nothing shoddy, sincerity, respect, and an altruistic intention, so that in every step of the process to keep in mind the person that I'm making the work for, as well as all who will view it, and to wish that my work will be of benefit to anyone who will view the piece. So with that, he encouraged me to go forth and to carry this tradition forth with my own, with how shall I say, with also allowing myself to express my own culture and the culture of the people that I might be making artwork for. So basically to inspire, to whatever will inspire the people that I'm coming in contact with. So later, this is another piece I made with that original tanka without eyes. This is the center inside the frame is all made with the Tibetan tradition that I've just shown you. And then this border is actually cotton quilting fabrics, and it's machine quilted in horizontal lines there. So it's a kind of combination of techniques. And then later I started also using the techniques to make some portraits and images based on photographs. This is an image of 3 Mongolians. A friend of mine, while I was in Dharamsala, he was an architect, and he made a trip to Mongolia and came back and was giving a presentation about Mongolian architecture. And he showed this slide of these 3 people conversing. I mean, there's so many emotions. I can imagine hearing their conversation and their attitudes toward one another. But what struck me when I looked at the slide was their robes were made of the same kind of silk satin, at least it appeared that way, as I was using to make tankas. And so I thought, well, what if I make them out of the fabric? So this was my first experiment into that world of portraiture, which I really enjoyed. And then I worked on this one where I actually used the photograph itself and printed it onto fabric, and then had the figures come to life out of it. So the background is printed, inkjet printer on fabric, and then quilted, lightly quilted in the background. And then the girls are done in non-traditional materials, but traditional Tibetan applique techniques. And this is a photograph by Diane Barker, who's a friend of mine, an English photographer who has done a lot of work with Tibetan nomads, and in fact has her own book out just this past year. And then the last piece I did, the most recent piece, was a medicine Buddha. This is a medicine Buddha, healing Buddha. And I started this when my mother was in cancer treatment, and I wanted to provide some healing energy. And as I was working on it, first of all, the treatment was successful and my mom got well. And in the process, I no longer wanted to do the setting that I had originally planned. I had a drawing, I had, these flowers and a different kind of landscape. It was very traditional. And as I was working on it, it didn't ring true for me anymore. And I'm sure some of you in your own art making have had that happen, where halfway through a project, it's like, no, that's not the direction I want to take. So I put it aside, and it stayed aside for about 5 years. This is just, you can see the background again, the back of the fabric. So this stayed inactive, dormant for about 5 years. And then we had a pandemic, and the whole earth needed healing. And so I finally knew what to do with my background. I created this design where there's the waterfall flowing from the mountains and then offering the earth to the medicine Buddha for healing. And one of the things that characterized that time that unfortunately has passed for now, it seems, but at that time, there was such a sense of unity. At least I felt it. There wasn't a sense of division. There was a sense of, for the first time in my life, all the world was facing a common challenge. The way it appeared in each person's life in each country was very different because of family situations, socioeconomic situations, health circumstances, all of that. So everybody, of course, had a different experience, but we were unified. We were all facing this virus and its challenges. And if you recall, people were singing on their balconies and coming together. There was a real sense of unity. And the phrase, "we're all in this together," just kept coming to mind. So I reached out to people all over the world on my mailing list and friends, and I asked them, how do you say we're all in this together in your language? And I received 28 languages from around the world, and I printed them and stitched them into the border of this piece. And many of them had their way of saying we're all in this together was some version of we're all in the same boat. And so I ended up using these watery fabrics and the boat, which also links to a Buddhist metaphor that comes up a lot of, may I be a boat or a ferryman to help people across the ocean of suffering to freedom. So this piece was one of my most satisfying because it felt like all these people around the world were working with me, and that they kept me company during the stay-at-home time of the early days of COVID pandemic. And this piece now is part of the Sacred Threads quilt exhibition. It was there in Virginia when was that? Last year, but now it's for 2 years. It's in the traveling show of the Sacred Threads quilt exhibition. So I don't know the schedule. You can go on their website, Sacred Threads Quilts, and find out the schedule if it might be near you. It's not coming to Southern California, So I'm about done now. I would just like to invite any of you, if you've liked what you've heard, I'd love to have you on my mailing list and stay connected. Every Monday, I send an image from one of the tankas, often a close-up like this, so you can really see the detail, with a quote, an inspiring quote from Buddhism or aligned with Buddhism to inspire and maybe align your intention for the week. It's not a long newsletter. It's just a pick me up and a get me going thing. And then finally, I would love it if you would read my book. So it's available wherever books are sold. Threads of Awakening, An American Woman's Journey into Tibet's Sacred Textile Art. You can find out more at threadsofawakening.com/book, or you can just go to Amazon or bookshop.org or your local bookshop and request it. And I didn't make it specifically for Fowler, but last week I spoke to the Embroiderers Guild of America, and I made a special web page on my site. So it's threadsofawakening.com/EGA. If you go there, you can download the introduction for free and just get a taste of the book if you like. So that's threadsofawakening.com/EGA. And that is it. And I would love to take any of your questions and comments and curiosities. So whatever you have.
Thank you, Leslie, so much. That was a wonderful and inspiring and just beautiful presentation. So I can't thank you enough. I'm going to read Sherry Hunter's comment in the chat section, but I do have a question for you, and I hope others will start to ask in the chat section as well. But because this is a sacred Tibetan art practice. I wonder sort of about like, is it permissible? I mean, I'm guessing it is, but to be teaching it outside of Tibet, like how is that seen?
Yeah, I mean, that was, as I said, when I met with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, that was a big part of what I wanted to ask him was what, about exhibiting and teaching and all of that. And I really felt authorized by his response. The main thing was, as long as you are sincere and honest, you don't pretend to be something you're not, which I'm always saying to people, I am not a spiritual teacher. I just make pretty things and I can show you how to make these pretty things too. and that they come from a lineage that is deeply spiritual and meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
And what has surprised me, actually, because I'm always clear, like I'm not qualified to teach you. And also one could argue with that, because obviously I have studied and practiced for a long time, so I can share my experience, but I'm not a teacher of the spiritual tradition.
Mm-hmm.
But what has been interesting to me is that the students who do come to me, they do find spiritual and psychological awakenings through their practice. And I don't know if it's the energy conveyed in this tradition from just generations of practitioners, or to what extent it's in the images themselves, or, and this is probably the biggest one, it's the intention with which the people come to it. So many of my students are already engaged in a spiritual practice, and so they're open and receptive to having it be an opening for them. So, and I think a lot of textile art, a lot of hand workers find a spiritual aspect to their handwork anyway. It brings us in touch with ourselves. I don't know if that exactly answers your question. Does that get at what is there
Oh, absolutely. I was just sort of curious about that. And also, I mean, they're so beautifully detailed, and I know that the stitching takes time. Like approximately how long do these pieces take you from start to finish?
The simpler one, so something like this where it's a figure and there's not a lot of detailed background, probably about 4 or 5 months of pretty full-on work. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the more elaborate, like that piece that I took to see the Dalai Lama, which mm-hmm. had lots of figures in the background, that was over a year, probably a year and a half.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Incredible. And so you were there for 20 years.
I was in India about 9 years.
9 years. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's primarily what you were doing during the 9 years. Okay.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Full time, 7 days.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I'll just read. Sherry Hunter said in 2006, along with Michael Rohde, they traveled around the eastern grasslands of Tibet. And they visited a contemporary Thangka workshop in Tongren, where they were cutting and assembling fabric thangkas. There, they were using what looked like acetate fabric and cut out the pieces and wrap them around pre-cut pieces of cardstock paper, sealing with an iron, which was left on hot coals to be kept hot. There was no embroidery or couching on the outlines, and the colors were electrically synthetic.
Right. Yes.
She says, I assume later a shortcut process.
Yes. Interesting that you saw that. So that's interesting, because I have seen those thangkas. I have not been witness to their creation the way you have. So that's interesting about the sealing with an iron left on hot coals. But that technique, which is done in eastern Tibet, in Amdo, I mean, I have seen some really beautiful examples of it that are older, that are maybe 100 years old or something. But most of the more recent ones, the contemporary ones, like you said, are made with synthetic materials, very kind of fluorescent colors often. And the details, so the eyes and the face and some of the contour lines are painted on. They're not embroidered. And sometimes they're done very, very well, and sometimes they're not done so well. I met I met a young Tibetan man once who did that technique, and he said to me, "I can make a Buddha in 3 days. How long does it take you?" So it's a different approach and a different style, and it doesn't involve any stitching. And I don't know the history of that form. I don't know where it came from, but I know that it is mostly done in that one part of Amdo. But there are some beautiful examples of it. You know, there's different levels of it. So that's fascinating that you got to see it. I would like to myself. Oh, I can't hear you, Chris. You're muted.
Sherry also said she has photos of peace tongas if you are interested.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Okay. And so another question, that the pieces you showed depicting ordinary people as opposed to sacred or devotional subjects are fascinating and beautiful. Can you speak a little more about how it is viewed in Tibet using these traditional techniques for more contemporary subjects?
All I know, I don't know how it would be viewed in Tibet itself, but I know that some Tibetans have seen, you know, I can only speak to individuals who have seen the work and have been appreciative. Nobody has criticized me for it. Because it's not, how can I say this? I would never mess with the sacred imagery. There's a difference between the sacred imagery and the stitching techniques. Stitching techniques can be applied to, it's like a language. A language can be used to express all kinds of things, right? And I feel very much like the Dalai Lama was saying that to me. In fact, he encouraged me when in that meeting to make Christian and Muslim images. You know, he's very engaged with interfaith dialogue. And he also, while he is clearly a Buddhist teacher, he always tells people who are not Tibetan or who are not from traditionally Buddhist countries, he says, don't become Buddhist. Use what you learn to be better in your own culture, in your own tradition, to wake up, you know, to augment, to enhance your own practices. So he was kind of saying that to me as well. And I think that is always welcome. It would not be welcome. And I asked several lamas before seeing the Dalai Lama, it would not be welcome to put the sacred images, to put the images of the deities or the Buddhas in a disrespectful, you know, like to put it in the pocket of the girl walking on the road or something. Like, I asked them about putting Buddha images or deity images in different contexts instead of the traditional forms that come from Chinese art and Nepali art and Tibetan art over the centuries that have happened. There are some Thangka painters, for example. There's a Thangka painter who lives in Hawaii, I think, who puts the sacred images in a tropical landscape. And that's fine because the Buddhas are ever present, right? So they're present wherever you are, and that's your environment. So the feedback that I received from all the lamas I spoke with was, absolutely, you can put them in different environments, but make sure it's an environment of respect, aspiration, upliftment, not, you know, underneath the pile of garbage, you know, all these kinds of things. So I think that's the general thing. It's always about respect and honesty and sincerity and intention.
Well, Michael Rohde writes that this was a wonderful and great addition to what he learned reading your book. The book is a must read. It's an easy read with short chapters, he says, to the point and inspiring for so many reasons. I just ordered a copy on Amazon. I hope that you all will get a copy. And also, I just want to remind you that this is recorded. If you would like a link to the recording, we will have it on the Fowler's member program portal. You can also reach out to me or Monica for the link. And I just want to say that if you haven't yet, I encourage you to visit the Fowler soon to see Visualizing Devotion, Jane embroidered shrine hangings. If you haven't yet, These are also exquisite textiles of velvet and sateen cloth embroidered with gold and silver gilt thread. They are visual references to the Jain religion of India. They are also promise gifts to the Fowler on view through March 26th. Also, very exciting, coming next month is the opening of another textile-related exhibition at the Fowler, Mirlan Constant, The Work of Radiance. This is a 30-year retrospective of Mirlan Constant's work and the first solo museum exhibition in the United States devoted to the work of a Haitian female artist. Constant creates often monumental in size, incredibly detailed, hand-beaded and embroidered tapestries that depict Haitians, Catholic saints, and voodoo spirits in Haitian history and everyday life. On March 25th, Textile Council members will be invited to an artist and curated-led tour of this magnificent exhibition. We're putting links in the chat section to this and to Visualizing Devotion. And lastly, if you are not a member of the Fowler yet and you're interested in learning more about the Textile Council, the Fowler offers unique opportunities to learn more about textiles from around the globe, such as this beautiful presentation by Leslie. It's also a wonderful and cherished group of the Fowler Museum. So there's a link to the Textile Council if you should be interested in learning more. And Leslie, I can't thank you enough. This was just an absolutely terrific presentation. I learned so much. I am inspired by you. Your work is incredible and beautiful. And I thank all of you for joining us, and we hope to see you soon. And if anybody wants to say hello and turn on their video, you're more than welcome to do that, because I know that we don't get to see each other as often as we'd like.
Thank you so much. This was really wonderful. I really appreciate it.
Great. Can we get gallery view, Monica? And we can end recording also.
Mhm.
Okay, well, great. Well, thank you all. You're so shy.